If you've learned about the Civil War, you probably know that the Confederacy was a group of states that supported slavery. But what you might not know is that Confederate monuments still stand today. In fact, as of 2019, there are more than 1,700 Confederate symbols, 103 public schools named after Confederates, and more than 700 Confederate monuments and statues in public places. Many of these were put up in the 1920s and 1960s, long after the Civil War had ended, in order to scare civil rights activists. But even today, our taxpayers' money goes to these statues. In fact, at least $40 million has gone to the keeping of these statues. So we're paying to keep these statues up. Let me ask you, do we really want people from young children to adults to have to see monuments of a group that fought for slavery? A group that was treasonous? Some people say that taking down these statues would be erasing history. But what kind of history do the statues show? They show a glorified version of the Confederacy, as if it was something to honor. It doesn't show the unspeakable horrors of slavery, and understates the terrible pain that Black people experienced. I want you to imagine for a moment what it would be like if a statue of Hitler was put up. What would people do? They would be outraged. The world would be outraged. So why aren't people as outraged about these Confederate statues, and why do some people still want to keep them up? The answer has to do with the reason we need to discuss this stuff. This history is not taught well enough. Pause and take a moment to think about some people you learn about in history in school. Share some of these names with your group. Pause the video now. Now, let's look back at all the responses. How many people of color were said? How many women were there? If you think about how you learned history, you might realize that a lot of it is taught through a white male perspective. A lot of our history is also whitewashed. How many of you remember George Washington as a hero, the father of our country? While he did lead the colonies to independence, he himself was a slave owner. Think about what you learned about slavery in school. Often this is whitewashed and not shown as the cruel, awful thing that it really was. Some textbooks even call slaves workers of Africa and show them as loyal and well treated by their masters. Sometimes slavery might not even be taught. How many of you have heard the story of the first Thanksgiving, but not the stories of the Native American people who were killed or forced off their lands by European settlers? For example, raise your hand if you learned about the California missions in 4th grade. What were you taught at school about the missions? What do you think that they are? Some schools teach students content in a way that makes them think that the missions were safe and good places for California Native Americans to stay in. This is not true. Native Americans were forcibly converted to Catholicism and forced to work as slaves. They were often whipped and tortured and even exterminated by the friars. Disease and starvation also killed thousands of people in these missions. One missionary actually celebrated Native American children dying because it meant that, according to him, more souls were going to heaven. Think about this for a moment. Can you imagine that? Our history is filled with events. Some of them are glorious, but some of them are horrifying. But we have to learn about all of it. We have to acknowledge that these things all happened. We have to face our past in order to move forward as a fairer and more just society. Many people think that we're in a post-racial America. We've elected a Black president, and we've made changes to our country. Things like slavery and segregation are not legal anymore, so it's all good, right? But as you can see from looking at the news and from reading the resources we've provided for you, racism is still very real. But the good news is we can do something about this. We can change things. And simply being here with your group and taking part in this conversation is so important. If we talk and spread awareness about the racism in our country, we can find solutions.